Colombia is the largest producer of cocaine in the world, and as of 2024, around 84% of all the cocaine consumed in the United States can be traced back to Colombia. The drug is typically made in clandestine labs, deep in the rainforest and hidden beneath thick jungle canopies. It starts with coca leaves, which are mixed with gasoline and other chemicals to make a thick paste called cocaine base. That base is then processed into solid bricks, each weighing roughly a kilogram, or about 2.2 pounds. A single brick can contain between 15,000 to 35,000 doses, and there are 1,000 kilograms in a ton of cocaine. To mark their product, traffickers often stamp the bricks with logos or symbols, basically branding them so people know who the shipment belongs to. Once processed, most of this cocaine flows north through what's known as the Central American route. It typically moves from Colombia into Venezuela, and from there through Honduras. It is then transported across the border into Guatemala, and then passes into Mexico before eventually reaching the United States. It is estimated that around 90% of the cocaine that enters Honduras is ultimately headed for the U.S. Cocaine gets more expensive as it is transported to the United States. In 2016, a kilo of cocaine cost about $1,725 in Colombia. But in Honduras, that same kilo was worth about $13,500. By the time it got to Mexico, it could reach $17,000. And once in the United States, that same kilo could cost up to $40,000 in places like New York City. For many years, the Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, dominated the global cocaine trade and were the largest drug trafficking organization. But they didn't do it alone. While Colombian producers and Mexican cartels like Chapo's get much of the global media attention, traffickers in Honduras and Guatemala are equally important in moving cocaine into the United States. Much of the cocaine trafficked by the Sinaloa cartel passed through Honduras, as they used Honduras as a key transit point between the cocaine labs in Colombia and the cartel-controlled territories inside Mexico. The Sinaloa cartel had help, most notably from Juan Orlando Hernández Alvarado, and his brother Juan Antonio Hernandez Alvarado, also known as Tony Hernandez. However, the brothers weren't just ordinary drug traffickers. Juan Orlando was once the president of Honduras, and his brother Tony was a sitting member of the Honduran Congress. Tony took large bribes from major traffickers disguised as campaign donations, sometimes for himself, and at other times on behalf of high-level Honduran politicians, including his brother. Juan Orlando's rise to the presidency was bankrolled by drug money from some of the most violent and powerful traffickers in the world. In return, the brothers offered protection and inside information to those traffickers. Tony paid off law enforcement for sensitive intel, which he passed along to smugglers to help them move their cocaine safely across Honduras. The shipments came in through all kinds of routes: planes, fast boats, and even, at least once, a submarine. But Tony wasn't just helping others move drugs. He had his own product headed to the U.S. as well. He had access to labs in both Honduras and Colombia, and even bragged about running cocaine labs in Colombia with a trafficker named Rodolfo Alfredo Vergara Bonafante, also known as El Cinco. Some of the bricks they produced were stamped with Tony Hernandez's initials, TH, styled after the Tommy Hilfiger logo. These TH bricks were part of the shipments being sold to El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel. Tony also played an active role in protecting these drug shipments with help of members of the Honduran National Police and traffickers with machine guns. He even helped arrange for traffickers to have access to helicopters to move the drugs. In total, the brothers helped transport over 400 tons of cocaine into the United States. And while he stood in front of microphones talking about fighting drug trafficking and cleaning up corruption behind closed doors, Juan Orlando was taking millions in drug money and protecting the very traffickers he claimed to be fighting. As Juan Orlando's political power grew, so did his arrogance. He believed he was untouchable, and for a while he was. He helped turn an entire country into a narco-state, but eventually he and his brother were arrested and are now serving very long sentences in the United States. Unlike a lot of people who turn to crime out of desperation because of poverty or lack of opportunities, Tony and Juan Orlando didn't have that excuse. They grew up extremely privileged, and they both held some of the highest political positions in Honduras. Juan Orlando himself described his childhood as comfortable. He spent time on his family's farm, helped care for animals, and rode horses with his sister and friends. His parents were supportive, and by his own account, his father made sure they had everything they needed. Juan Orlando studied abroad in the U.S., earning a master's degree in public administration, and later got a law degree in Honduras. He also served in the military before quickly rising through the ranks of Honduran politics. From a young age, Juan Orlando had advantages that most people in Honduras could only dream of, but that still wasn't enough. He wanted more, and he was willing to get it, no matter what. While he was consolidating power, most people in rural Honduras were living in poverty, nearly 80% surviving on less than $7 a day. As of 2023, about 14% of the population still couldn't read or write, and less than 60% of kids between 12 and 14 were still in school. And for those aged 15 to 17, that number dropped to less than 30%. But Juan Orlando never faced those struggles. He was in a position to make a real difference. But instead of using that privilege to help those who were struggling, he used it to gain more power and wealth for himself, often at the expense of the very people he was elected to serve. Politically, Honduras is split between two major parties, the Liberal Party and the National Party. And since at least 2000, both parties have played a role in facilitating widespread drug trafficking in exchange for massive bribes. Juan Orlando was a member of the National Party, and his rise in Honduran politics spanned over 2 decades. It all started back in 1998, when he was first elected as a congressman to represent Lempira. By the early 2000s, while still a congressman, he was already taking bribes from a known Honduran drug trafficker named Victor Hugo Diaz Morales, better known by his nickname Rojo. Victor was a violent and ruthless man who admitted to being involved in at least 18 murders. During a violent turf war with rival trafficker Hector Emilio Fernandez Rosa, aka Don H., each man tried to have the other killed. In a shocking act of brutality, Victor killed the 3-year-old daughter of one of Don H's supporters, which he confessed to. He also confessed to shooting his own wife in the face. Despite all of that, Victor was never arrested or seriously investigated in Honduras, largely because of the protection he got from the Hernandez brothers. In exchange for those bribes, Tony gave Victor sensitive law enforcement intelligence. The two men would meet around 3 or 4 times a year to confirm Tony received the bribes, and for him to provide Victor with that info. In a 2007 meeting, Tony gave him inside information about naval movements, intel that was extremely valuable to Victor, because a big part of his operation relied on smuggling cocaine into Honduras using fishing boats and high-speed go-fast vessels. Every time Tony gave him intel like that, Victor said he paid him $10,000. Victor also used planes and helicopters to bring cocaine into Honduras, so Tony would also provide him with military radar intel, what they referred to as TV, so the flights wouldn't be detected. And Victor said he paid him $50,000 for that kind of information. This intelligence helped Victor and Tony move an estimated 140,000 kilos of cocaine through Honduras between 2004 and 2016, without ever losing a single load to law enforcement. At times, Tony would supply the drugs for these shipments too. Victor said that in one deal he bought about 1,000 kilos of cocaine directly from Tony and Cinco, and the security for that deal was provided by the Honduran National Police. Victor also bought thousands of rounds of assault rifle ammunition, somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 rounds. He said he got them through a man named Norman Lozano, who claimed to have gotten the ammo directly from Tony. The bullets came packed in military-grade metal boxes, stamped with the Honduran National Army logo. In one meeting back in 2005, Tony asked Victor to contribute $40,000 to help fund his brother Juan Orlando's congressional campaign. Victor agreed and paid the money. Fernando Cheng Monroy, a Guatemalan trafficker tied to about 15 murders, was responsible for moving around 200,000 kilos of cocaine, most of it headed for the U.S. Out of that amount, about 15,000 kilos were moved with help from Tony. On one occasion, Fernando was involved in a 600-kilo deal, which was supplied by Tony himself. That shipment was delivered to Fernando at the Guatemala-Mexico border and then delivered straight to the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico City. Later in 2009, Fernando met with Tony again to negotiate another deal, this one for 700 kilos. During that meeting, Tony casually bragged about being able to get his hands on just about any weapon you could think of. M16s, RPGs, grenade launchers. He even mentioned the FN Herstal 5.7 pistol, which he referred to as a cop killer. The 700-kilo deal was finalized at that meeting. Before they moved the shipment, they followed Tony's instructions and gave the local police chief a heads-up, who was already in the loop thanks to Tony. Fernando received the cocaine at the border, and once again, it made its way to the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico City. He also bought around 100,000 rounds of ammunition from Victor, who told him the bullets came directly from Tony. In 2009, Juan Orlando, who was still a congressman, was running to become president of the Honduran National Congress, while his close ally from the National Party, Porfirio Pepe Lobo, launched his campaign for the presidency of Honduras. Around that time, Tony approached Victor and told him that if he contributed to the National Party's campaign, and if both Pepe Lobo won the presidency and Juan Orlando secured re-election to Congress, they'd be able to give him even greater access to intel from the Honduran National Police and military. Tony said that receiving better information would prevent the cocaine shipments from being seized. Juan Orlando promised that once they were both in power, he'd also be protected from extradition to the U.S. So Victor ended up giving over $100,000 in campaign contributions, split between Pepe and Juan Orlando. During that election cycle, both Pepe and Juan Orlando turned to another major trafficker for funding, Amílcar Alexander Ardón, the mayor of El Paraíso in Copan, a municipality in Honduras that was a key location in the cocaine trade due to its proximity to the Guatemalan border. In 2008, Amílcar had a private meeting with Pepe. He asked for three things: protection from arrest and extradition, a government job for his brother Hugo, and help paving roads in his municipality. Pepe agreed, but he had his own request: $2 million in cash. During that meeting, Pepe also made it clear that if he became president, he'd help Juan Orlando become president of the National Congress. Not long after, Amílcar sent him $1 million. Then in the summer of 2009, Honduras experienced a major political shift. Then President Manuel Zelaya was removed from office in a coup. Around that time, Tony met again with Amílcar. He told him that the coup would make it easier for his brother to become president of the HNC, and once there he'd have better access to sensitive government info. Tony also brought up the idea of forming a trafficking partnership. He mentioned he had connections with Colombian suppliers and wanted to learn more about Amílcar's roots and how he secured his shipments. Later that year, Amílcar sat down with both Pepe and Juan Orlando. Juan Orlando told him directly that he would stick to the promises Pepe made, and said that he didn't need to worry about law enforcement or prosecutors, because he would make sure he was protected. After that meeting, Amílcar sent another $1 million their way. Amílcar then sent his people to take control of polling stations around El Paraíso, and orchestrated the casting of around 3,000 fraudulent votes in support of National Party candidates, including Juan Orlando and Pepe. On November 29, 2009, both men won. Porfirio Pepe Lobo became the president of Honduras, and Juan Orlando was re-elected to Congress. Tony Hernandez made sure to keep dirty cops assigned where they could help them, officers who could turn a blind eye or actively help move drug shipments. He even went as far as to prevent certain officers from being reassigned. One of those officers was Police Chief Normando Rafael Lozano, who helped escort cocaine shipments for Victor. Other corrupt law enforcement tied to Tony include his own cousin, Mauricio Hernandez Pineda, and other officers including Juan Carlos El Tigre Bonilla, and Mario Guillermo Vargas, who is referred to in court records as Geovanny Rodriguez. Mario met Victor around 2005, and from there he started giving him updates about police checkpoints and helping provide security for shipments. Mario said he never met Tony face-to-face, but around 2011 and 2012, he was working for him indirectly through his cousin, Mauricio. His main job was providing security for drug shipments. Mario even trafficked drugs with two attorneys, Juan Manuel Abiameza and Oscar Ramirez. Ironically, they were the same lawyers who represented him when he was arrested in 2009 after he was accused of stealing drugs. Although he was convicted of abuse of power and breaching public trust, Mario managed to get the conviction thrown out by bribing a judge. Once that was done, he was reinstated to the National Police. Mauricio's involvement in the drug trade started around 2007. He personally moved cocaine for major players like his cousins and El Chapo across Honduras. He paid off other officers to make sure the vehicles containing the cocaine weren't searched at police checkpoints. In some cases, he even arranged for heavily armed police units with machine guns to secure the loads. He also passed along sensitive law enforcement information about counter-narcotics operations, helping the traffickers avoid arrests. In December 2009, members of the Honduran National Police murdered a man named Julian Aristides Gonzalez. Julian was the top anti-drug official in Honduras. Investigators later discovered that members of the Honduran National Police carried out the hit. The order was allegedly given by trafficker Wilter Blanco, furious that Julian's unit had seized a large shipment of his cocaine earlier that year. Individuals involved in the murder were later connected to Tony Hernandez. Several drug traffickers paid off those police officers to help carry out the hit on Julian. One of the documents from the investigations mentioned a surveillance video dated December 7, 2009. The footage, recorded around 7:22 p.m., reportedly shows a group of cops meeting to plan the assassination. It even shows cash being handed over to some of the individuals involved in the assassination. The very next morning on December 8th, Julian dropped off his daughter at school and began driving to work in his Nissan SUV, but his normal route was blocked. That's when a motorcycle with two men pulled up beside him. The passenger then pulled out a gun and fired, killing Julian instantly. It was later revealed that Julian was preparing to retire in January and had even planned to move to Canada because he was getting death threats. 2 years later, in 2011, Julian's top advisor, Alfredo Landaverde Hernandez, was murdered in the same way. Just days earlier, Alfredo accused police commanders of letting gangs infiltrate the force. In July 2010, Victor hosted his own birthday party. While Tony and Victor were talking, Tony brought up Juan Carlos El Tigre Bonilla. Juan Carlos joined the Honduran National Police back in 1985 and stayed until 2016. Juan Orlando and Tony used their political influence to help him move up the ranks in the Honduran National Police, first as a regional police chief, and later, from 2012 to 2013, as the chief of the Honduran National Police. In return, Juan Carlos provided security for their cocaine shipments. Tony told Victor that both he and Juan Orlando trusted Juan Carlos, and that he wasn't afraid to get violent, going so far as to suggest he was willing to carry out murders if necessary. Tony also reassured Victor that the odds of Honduras passing an extradition law were low, and even if the U.S. pushed for it and something did pass, he said there were ways to delay things through the Supreme Court. After hearing all that, Victor offered to help fund Juan Orlando's campaign to become the president of the Honduran National Congress. At some point, Juan Orlando reached out to Amílcar asking for a favor. He needed help bribing 3 congressmen in Copan, and the goal was to lock in the votes needed for Juan Orlando to become president of the Honduran National Congress. Amílcar came through and paid the bribes. He wasn't the only one backing Juan Orlando. Other major traffickers, including Miguel Arnulfo Valle and Luis Valle, leaders of the Los Valles cartel and suppliers to MS-13, were also offering their support. The Valles were one of the most powerful cocaine traffickers in the country at the time. There's even a photo of Miguel and Juan Orlando together at the 2010 World Cup. They attended the event together, and Juan Orlando personally asked him to support his campaign to become president of the HNC. By 2010, Juan Orlando was elected to lead the National Congress, and he served as the president of the HNC between 2010 and 2014. Once Juan Orlando was in power, he started delivering on the promises he'd made to Amílcar. One of the first moves was appointing Hugo to lead Fonda Vial, the government agency in charge of public infrastructure and construction. Hugo used that role to pave roads for drug shipments, and at the direction of both Juan Orlando and Amílcar, he awarded contracts to front companies controlled by major drug traffickers, allowing them to launder millions. Amílcar and Tony Hernandez then officially partnered up to move cocaine. Tony said he first got connected to Colombian cocaine suppliers through the Los Valles cartel, but now he wanted to operate on his own without relying on them. The men came up with a plan. They would receive shipments in eastern Honduras and then move the loads toward the Honduras-Guatemala border using either helicopters or trucks. Tony promised these shipments would be protected, thanks to his access to radar intel and contacts within the police. That's where Mauricio came in. At some point in 2010, Tony arranged a meeting in San Pedro Sula between Amílcar and Mauricio. And after that meeting, Tony and Amílcar started moving load after load, all under Mauricio's protection. Their drug shipments were typically transported in a caravan escorted by members of the Honduran National Police, many of them armed with automatic weapons. Before each shipment moved out, Mauricio would check which police officers were assigned to various checkpoints along the route. His job was to make sure the convoy could pass through without any issues. Dressed in full police uniform, Mauricio would lead the convoy himself, driving at the front and being the first to approach every checkpoint, and made sure the officers there had already been paid off to wave the shipment through. Once the drugs made it to Copan, Amílcar would step in and handle security from there to the Guatemalan border. Most of the shipments were several hundred to over 1,000 kilograms each. One of their biggest single shipment during that time was about 1,600 kilos, and some of those shipments belonged to El Chapo. Between 2010 and 2012, Amílcar and Tony helped move multi-ton loads of El Chapo's cocaine through Honduras, about once or twice a month, with Mauricio making sure nothing interfered with the shipments. Amílcar and Tony were selling drugs to El Chapo too. In at least 2 separate deals in 2011, Tony sold over 1,000 kilograms of cocaine to Amílcar, who then sold it to El Chapo, and some of the kilos were stamped with Tony's trademark TH stamp. Mauricio provided the police escorts for those loads as well. Tony helped Amílcar and his family move between 30 and 40 tons of cocaine from 2010 until 2018, just a portion of the estimated 250 tons Amílcar and his family smuggled into the U.S. Amílcar admitted he had made somewhere between $200 and $250 million from trafficking drugs. In 2011, while Tony and Amílcar were moving cocaine, a trafficker named Franklin Arita tried to block their shipments around the Santa Rita area of Copan. He warned them not to move drugs through his territory. Amílcar brought the issue up to Tony during one of their meetings, and also mentioned that Franklin had threatened a high-ranking Honduran police official, Juan Carlos. At the time, Juan Carlos was the regional chief with authority over the police in several departments along the Guatemalan border, including Copan. Tony immediately said that Franklin needed to be taken out. 2 weeks later, during another meeting, Tony told Amílcar that he'd already spoken to Juan Carlos about the situation, and that he was actively tracking Franklin's movements to figure out the best time to ambush and kill him. About a month later, in July 2011, Franklin was killed in Honduras. The hit was carried out by gunmen using 40mm grenade launchers, M16 rifles, and Galil assault rifles. Roughly a week later, Tony met again with Amílcar and brought up the killing. Tony asked him if he had seen the news reports, then confirmed that Juan Carlos was behind it. According to Tony, Franklin had heavy security protecting him, but Juan Carlos had access to armed units and armored vehicles, giving him enough firepower to pull off the murder. Reports show Juan Carlos himself took the lead in investigating the murder, going so far as to call the ambush well-planned. Juan Orlando began using his influence to protect other major traffickers, including Geovanny Fuentes Ramirez. His deal with Juan Orlando guaranteed safe passage for his cocaine shipments, help from the Honduran military, and protection from both investigation and extradition. He also used his drug money to bribe a high-ranking Honduran judge and other influential law enforcement officials. For example, one of his biggest supporters was General René Orlando Fonseca. He was the head of the 105th Battalion in San Pedro Sula, and later led the Northern Anti-Drug Task Force FUSINA, and ultimately became the head of all military forces in Honduras. Fonseca provided Fuentes with military support, gear, uniforms, and weapons. Fuentes got his start in the drug world as a sicario, or hired killer. Back in the 2000s, Fuentes and his partner Melvin Sanders were moving kilos of cocaine into Miami. Melvin was also a hitman for the Cachiros, one of the most violent and prolific drug trafficking organizations in Honduras. He also provided security for cocaine shipments. It was reported that the Los Cachiros controlled most of the clandestine airstrips in the country, like 90%, and used these airstrips to move drugs for Colombian and Mexican organizations, including El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel. Around 2009 or 2010, Fuentes and Melvin set up a cocaine lab in Cerro Negro, a mountainous region outside Choloma. The lab processed base cocaine smuggled in from Colombia on boats. About 2 months after the lab was up and running, Melvin arranged a meeting between Fuentes and his cousin, Davis Leonel Rivera Maradiaga, leader of Los Cachiros. They met at one of Davis's gas stations in Omoa. Davis admitted to personally ordering or carrying out 78 murders, injuring 15 others, and torturing people. He and his partner and brother Javier Rivera received cocaine shipments in Honduras by planes and boats. From there, they were moved across the country and sold off to other traffickers. He estimated that from 2002 until he surrendered to the DEA in 2015, Los Cachiros moved more than 130 tons of cocaine in the United States. From around 2004 to 2013, the Cachiros worked closely with the Valle brothers. During their first meeting, Fuentes gave Davis a full rundown of the lab operation and explained how he had connections with law enforcement, contacts that could help them move cocaine safely through the country. He asked Davis to join him and Melvin in the operation, offering a partnership that would include money for security and for more shipments of cocaine base from Colombia. Davis wasn't sold on the partnership, but agreed to buy 2 vehicles from Fuentes, paying about $50,000 more than what the cars were actually worth. After the Cachiros turned down his offer to invest in his cocaine lab, Fuentes asked another trafficker for help, Jose Miguel Handel Perez, also known as Chepe Handel, who operated out of San Pedro Sula. They partnered up, and Chepe helped bring in money, and also offered access to his network of corrupt law enforcement contacts in the San Pedro Sula area to protect the lab. A few months later, Davis, Melvin, and Fuentes met again, this time at Melvin's nightclub. During that conversation, Fuentes told Davis he recently killed a boat mechanic who owed Davis around $40,000. According to Fuentes, the man had been bad-mouthing Davis. With help from a local police chief in Acantilado, he took the mechanic to the Honduras-Guatemala border, tortured him by cutting off a finger and beating him in the face, then shot him twice in the head. He even showed Davis a photo of the body on his phone. Melvin chimed in and said Fuentes was the kind of guy who could kill anyone we want if we ask him to. After that meeting, Fuentes began working more directly with Davis, providing security for cocaine shipments. Fuentes and Melvin would organize convoys of trucks and armed guards to escort the loads, and they relied on their corrupt police contacts to help the shipments pass through checkpoints. Fuentes himself personally carried a Glock he modified to be fired automatically, and also carried an AR-15. He traveled in a truck that had hidden compartments for extra weapons, and his team was armed to the teeth, including with a 40mm grenade launcher in case someone tried to intercept or hijack the cocaine shipment. 3 or 4 months after the first shipment, Fuentes coordinated another load with Davis, this time between 500 and 570 kilos of cocaine. The shipment arrived by plane in eastern Honduras at an airstrip controlled by Freddy Renan Nahira Montoya, a sitting Honduran congressman at the time. Freddy would later plead guilty to multiple federal charges. Fuentes would go on to work with the Los Cachiros more regularly, helping produce and transport cocaine shipments for them. In 2011, while Fuentes was still moving large half-ton cocaine shipments for the Cachiros, his cocaine lab in Choloma was raided by Honduran law enforcement. They didn't find any drugs or Fuentes himself. That's because he had already been tipped off by Chepe. Around the same time, Fuentes got another warning from Polito Crivelli, the son of Choloma's mayor, Leopoldo Crivelli. Polito told him that the lab was being investigated by police, who raided his lab shortly after. After the raid, Fuentes left Choloma to avoid getting arrested. Approximately 30 to 40 days after the raid, Fuentes went to the offices of Graneros, a grain company in Choloma run by a man named Fuad Harufi. Fuentes had been using Graneros to launder some of his drug money with Fuad's help. While he was there, he met with Julio Cesar Barahona, who at the time was serving as president of the judiciary in Honduras, a position appointed by the HNC. Judge Barahona told Fuentes that he'd been sent by the boss to help, meaning Juan Orlando. The meeting happened in Fuad's office, and Barahona told Fuentes that he would make sure that there was no investigation or arrest tied to his cocaine lab, and that he'd keep law enforcement off his back. After the meeting ended, Fuad instructed the company's accountant, Jose Sanchez, who was present for the meeting, to cut a check to Barahona for 30,000 lempiras from Fuentes' account. Once Fuentes got his cocaine lab back up and running, now with protection from police, he stepped up his operation massively. A few months later, the police officer who organized that raid was drinking at Melvin's nightclub. Fuentes and Melvin recognized him immediately. The men and their sicarios kidnapped him and took him to Laguna de Ticamaya, a lake just outside Choloma. There they tortured him, beat him, hit him in the face, put a plastic bag over his head to suffocate him, put pins through his fingers, and beat his hands with a pistol. The officer pleaded for his life, saying he had a young daughter who he didn't want to leave an orphan. The whole point of the torture was to find out if Fuad had been mentioned in the lab investigation. When the officer finally convinced them that Fuad's name hadn't come up, Fuentes killed him by shooting him 3 times in the head. In January 2012, Honduras changed its constitution to allow the extradition of Honduran nationals to the United States to face drug trafficking charges. When that happened, Amílcar asked Tony why Juan Orlando had agreed to it. Tony explained that the decision wasn't really voluntary, and that he only agreed to it because of pressure from the United States on both Juan Orlando and President Pepe Lobo. But Tony reassured him that he and Hugo didn't need to worry, and that the law wouldn't apply to them. Around the same time the extradition law passed, Juan Orlando started campaigning for his first term as the president of Honduras. Publicly, he named Amílcar and Hugo, who was still running Fondo Vial, as the leaders of the National Party's re-election effort in Copan. But later that year, Amílcar met with Juan Orlando at his house, and during that meeting, Juan Orlando asked him not to run for mayor again. He said Amílcar was attracting too much attention, and him being involved in politics is starting to create problems for him. Juan Orlando told him the media was already talking too much about his drug ties and how he helped fund his campaign. So they made a deal. If Amílcar agreed to step aside, Hugo could keep his position as head of Fondo Vial, and both of them would continue to get the same protection from prosecution they had under President Lobo's administration. Amílcar stepped aside and in return continued to receive protection. But not everyone took that advice. Arnaldo Urbina Soto, another trafficker who happened to be the National Party mayor of Yoro, was reportedly given a similar warning. Juan Orlando told him to keep a low profile and stay out of politics, but Arnaldo didn't listen. He ran for office again in 2013 and was eventually arrested, almost certainly under Juan Orlando's orders. He stayed in custody until he was extradited to the U.S. in February 2023. At some point that year, Tony told Amílcar that he wasn't going to sell him cocaine anymore because he was running for congressional office, but he'd still help in other ways. Between 2012 and 2014, Tony rented helicopters to Amílcar so he could transport cocaine and drug money, charging about $50,000 per trip. Tony also made sure those flights were protected. He used his access to radar systems and law enforcement intel to make sure everything got through without being detected. Around 2012, Hugo and Amílcar met with Juan Orlando to ask for a favor. Amílcar was facing threats from rival traffickers, and Juan Orlando offered to deploy the Honduran military to provide protection. Later, when Hugo thanked him, Juan Orlando told him, "We're on the same team." In the lead up to the 2013 presidential election, Juan Orlando started accepting millions of dollars from drug traffickers and even misappropriated Honduran government funds for his campaigns. In 2012, Juan Orlando attended a birthday party for Ramon Moncho Lobo, brother of then-President Pepe Lobo. Many other known drug traffickers were in attendance, including Davis and Javier from Los Cachiros, along with National Party Congressman Oscar Najera. During the party, Davis and Javier talked openly about using drug money to support Juan Orlando's campaign, specifically by bribing election workers in Colón. After the party, Oscar followed up with Davis, asking for cash to carry out those bribes. He explained that Juan Orlando promised him that if he won the presidency, Oscar would be made president of the National Congress. Davis then had a worker give Oscar 300,000 lempiras for Juan Orlando's campaign. In total, Davis admitted that he paid $250,000 in bribes to Juan Orlando, $50,000 to Tony Hernandez, and $800,000 to Juan Orlando's allies. He also bribed Pepe Lobo, giving him around $600,000. He also gave more bribes through Pepe's son, Fabio. Not long after the party, Javier delivered $250,000 to Hilda Hernandez, Juan Orlando's sister, on behalf of Los Cachiros. In a separate transaction, Fabio and Javier gave $200,000 to Hilda as another campaign donation. Other traffickers who bribed Juan Orlando include Erlinda Ramos Bobadilla, a leader of the Montes Bobadilla trafficking organization, who contributed $300,000 to his campaign. Another trafficker, Sergio Neftali, paid Juan Orlando $100,000 and let him use his helicopter during the campaign. In 2013, Honduran drug trafficker Neri Lopez Sanabria, also known as Magdaleno Meza Funes, or just Wilson, gave Tony a duffel bag filled with $4 million on behalf of the Los Valles cartel. Juan Orlando didn't just take money from local drug traffickers. He also accepted bribes from major international traffickers, and among the biggest was El Chapo. In 2013, two key meetings went down in Copan, bringing together some of the most powerful narco-traffickers. El Chapo, Tony Hernandez, Amílcar, and Hugo were all there. The meeting went down at a ranch owned by the Los Valles, and this was the first time Tony met El Chapo face-to-face. El Chapo told Tony he wanted more protection for his drug routes through Honduras, specifically for cocaine shipments traveling from Nicaragua to the Guatemala border. In return, he offered $1 million to support Juan Orlando's presidential campaign. Tony didn't accept the money right away and said he'd run it by his brother, who agreed to take the money and said he urgently needed it for the campaign. At the second meeting, Tony promised him that if Juan Orlando won, Chapo's shipments would move freely, and none of his partners, including the Valles and Amílcar, would be extradited. And with that, El Chapo gave Tony the $1 million in cash. Carlos Lobo, a Honduran drug trafficker who worked with the Sinaloa cartel, also contributed campaign donations to Juan Orlando. And in total, the Sinaloa cartel would go on to contribute around $2.4 million to Juan Orlando's campaign. And it wasn't just the cartels funding him. Juan Orlando also received money from other politicians, including Yankel Rosenthal from the opposition Liberal Party. At one point, Juan Orlando asked an individual for a major campaign donation. During their conversation, he casually admitted that he'd stolen U.S. aid money through NGOs and had also stolen from Honduras's Social Security Fund. Around 2013, Fuentes had already moved 3 major cocaine shipments for the Sinaloa cartel, around 500, 1,000, and 1,500 kilos each. But the last shipment had issues. The drugs got wet, which lowered the quality and ultimately the price they could sell it for. Around the same time, he fronted 100 kilos of cocaine to Edgar Pluto Rios on consignment. That meant Edgar was expected to sell the drugs and pay Fuentes back from the proceeds. But the coke was low-grade quality and Edgar couldn't move it. When Edgar couldn't cover the debt, Fuentes and Melvin allegedly hired a hitman named Vaquero to take him out. There were more killings tied to Fuentes during this period. After 2 hitmen killed Melvin's brother over a drug debt, Fuentes decided to retaliate. He tracked them down with the help of Melvin and Juan Manuel Avila Meza, who at the time was a member of the Honduran National Police. The 3 men spotted the sicarios driving and boxed them in using their cars. They pulled the men out, kidnapped them, and took them to a ranch. Once there, they beat and tortured them before shooting them. Then Fuentes doused the bodies in gasoline, and Juan Manuel set them on fire. Jose Sanchez, the accountant at Graneros, the grain company which Fuentes used to launder some of his money, had been working there for a long time. Over the years, he saw firsthand how the relationship between Juan Orlando and Fuentes evolved into a full-blown drug trafficking partnership. Throughout 2013, Jose watched as Juan Orlando showed up at Graneros every month to collect what was described as a campaign check. Over time, he realized these weren't campaign donations, they were drug money payouts. In 2013, Fuentes met twice with Juan Orlando at Graneros, and Jose was there for both meetings. In those 2 meetings, Jose said that Fuentes handed Juan Orlando a total of $25,000 in cash. In the first meeting, Juan Orlando specifically requested access to Fuentes' lab, pointing out its proximity to Puerto Cortés, Honduras's largest port city. Fuentes agreed, and in return, Juan Orlando told him that he would protect him, and told him that the drugs would be protected by the military and police, who would handle the security. He also mentioned that Attorney General Oscar Chinchilla had been appointed specifically to protect them and their operations. He gloated that, by the time the gringos find out, we will have eliminated extradition. He said, we'll be untouchable. Juan Orlando also said something that stuck with Jose. He said he and Fuentes would stuff the drugs up the gringos' noses and they're never even going to know it. Jose also remembered overhearing Juan Orlando mock the Honduran people. He called them indios and joked that they'd sell their vote for nothing more than a piece of steak and a beer. Juan Orlando told Fuentes to coordinate the drug shipments directly with his brother Tony. At the end of that first meeting, Fuentes gave Juan Orlando a cash bribe of $15,000. In their second meeting, after some brief talk about politics, Fuentes handed over another $10,000. Following those meetings, Fuentes in fact received the promised support from the Honduran military. Concerned by what he was witnessing, Jose started documenting what he could. He eventually turned over 2 video recordings of Juan Orlando to prosecutor Marlene Banegas and a man named Christian Ayala, who he believed could help get the evidence to the right people. Marlene reportedly passed one of the recordings to the Honduran Attorney General Oscar Chinchilla. About a month later, she was murdered. Christian was killed roughly 2 weeks after receiving his copy. Jose ended up fleeing the country. In 2013, the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control designated Los Cachiros, its two leaders, and many of their front companies under the Kingpin Act. Following these designations, Davis and Javier Maradiaga began cooperating with the DEA. Davis admitted that even while he was working with the DEA, he still ordered the murders of 3 people. For example, Christian Daniel Hernandez, better known as El Chino, worked for Wilter Blanco, and he helped receive cocaine shipments that were flown in by helicopter. Chino was arrested in 2013 in connection to drug trafficking in Cologne, and Wilter was worried that he might start talking. Amílcar informed Tony about the arrest, who told him that Chino knew too much and needed to go. Amílcar agreed to talk to Wilter about having Chino murdered, and Wilter then asked Davis if he could arrange to have Chino killed. Davis agreed, and Chino was later murdered while in custody. After the murder, Tony called Amílcar and said he'd seen the news. They met in person not long after, and Tony told him he was relieved that Chino was dead. Amílcar alone contributed around $1.5 million in drug money to bribe politicians across Copan to support Juan Orlando. Tony actively pushed Amílcar to use that money to rally support from all the mayors in Copan. Amílcar ended up paying off nearly every one of them, making it clear each time that the money was in exchange for helping Juan Orlando win the election. In return, Juan Orlando not only offered continued protection, he also promised to funnel government contracts to Copan. That would help Amílcar and Hugo to continue laundering money, while also improving infrastructure in their territory, including roads used to move cocaine. Throughout 2012 and 2013, Hugo stayed in touch with Juan Orlando, usually once or twice a week through a messaging app. Juan Orlando would update him on polling numbers and let him know the areas where his support was low. Amílcar responded by paying bribes in those towns to get their support for Juan Orlando. In early 2013, Hugo mentioned that he and Amílcar were planning to pay off election workers to change the results at certain polling stations. Juan Orlando didn't push back. Instead, he basically said the ends justified the means. Whatever they had to do to win, they'd do. In the lead up to the 2013 election, Hugo traveled with Juan Orlando's brothers, Amílcar and Marcos, to towns in Copan where support was low. There they used drug money to bribe officials who controlled the voting centers to manipulate the vote count in Juan Orlando's favor. The Tribunal Supremo Electoral, or TSE, was the country's electoral tribunal, which was responsible for certifying the election results. Hugo brought in an engineer to shut down the TSE's servers so that the vote count could be manipulated in Juan Orlando's favor. At the time, Juan Orlando's main rival, Ricardo Alvarez, challenged the results of the 2012 National Party primary. He accused Juan Orlando of fraud and pushed for a recount. But by then, the Supreme Court of Honduras, or the Corte Suprema de Justicia, was already stacked with judges loyal to Juan Orlando, and the court ultimately rejected Ricardo's appeal. Juan Orlando went on to win the 2013 presidential election, and ironically, Ricardo Alvarez ended up serving as his vice president. Tony Hernandez was also elected to Congress in the Lempira department, and started using his position to help drug traffickers and promote corrupt cops. Juan Orlando officially took office as President of Honduras in January 2014. As president, he publicly promoted an image of being tough on crime. He and other political leaders gave speeches about fighting drug traffickers and supporting the United States in its war on drugs. But privately, it was a very different story. The reality is that most of the traffickers involved with Juan Orlando and his brother were never held accountable in Honduras. Prosecutors never brought charges against them, and investigations were blocked. However, there was one major exception: the extradition of Miguel and his brother Luis Valle, the leaders of the Los Valles cartel. In December 2013, U.S. prosecutors charged the Valle brothers with a cocaine importation conspiracy in Florida. Then in June 2014, they were hit with more drug trafficking charges in Virginia. That year, the U.S. Treasury designated the Valle brothers as specially designated narcotics traffickers under the Kingpin Act, describing their cartel as one built on a mix of brutal violence and public corruption. But that designation alone didn't seal their fate. It was their threat to Juan Orlando that did. In December 2014, Honduras extradited them. They eventually pleaded guilty in 2016 in both cases and were each sentenced to 30 years in prison. On the surface, the extradition seemed like a major step forward in Honduras's fight against narco-trafficking. However, justice had nothing to do with it. The real reason the Valle brothers were handed over to the U.S. authorities was personal. According to Tony, the Valle brothers plotted to kill his brother. Davis said that the brothers approached him about the plan around 2014, but he refused to participate in the murder. In the summer of 2013, authorities in Honduras arrested two Colombian nationals, Ruben Dario Pinilla and Freddy Hernandez, near La Iguala in the Lempira region. They were suspected of growing marijuana and opium poppies and operating a drug lab. Interestingly, the law firm where Tony Hernandez worked at the time ended up representing both men. The charges were eventually dropped, and both Colombians were released. Around that time, a witness said that a local Honduran police officer in Lempira named Constantino Zavala had warned other officers not to mess with the Colombians. He reportedly told them the growers were protected and said that both he and Tony were the ones providing that protection. The witness later met with Constantino and Tony to talk about the arrests. During that meeting, Tony personally thanked Constantino for his help. Ruben Dario Pinilla was arrested again in January 2014 for growing marijuana and opium poppies. This time, a Honduran man named Jester Orlando Jacinto Miranda was arrested with him. Some of the prosecutors and police involved in those 2013 and 2014 cases were later investigated for corruption, and Constantino was suspended in February 2014. A month later, in March, Walter Levi Guerrero, a law enforcement officer who had taken part in the investigation of the two Colombians, was murdered in San Pedro Sula. In 2014, as the Honduran government started seizing properties tied to Los Cachiros, after the U.S. Treasury's OFAC formally designated the group, Fabio Lobo had a conversation with Juan Orlando. Fabio told him that the government had already gone far enough and suggested he should keep supporting the Cachiros instead of turning on them. One of the ways Davis laundered drug money was through government highway contracts. After the construction was finished, the government would deposit payments directly into accounts linked to his front company, Inrimar. By the time Juan Orlando became president, the government still owed Inrimar a significant chunk of money. While working with the DEA, the Maradiaga brothers made numerous recordings of politicians and drug traffickers discussing bribes paid to various politicians, including Juan Orlando, for their support and protection from extradition. In early 2014, Davis met with Juan Orlando and several other people, including Juan Avila Meza, to talk about getting those contracts paid out. During those meetings, he wore a hidden camera in his watch and recorded everything. According to Davis, Juan Avila told him that Tony wanted to work with him in drug trafficking, and that he'd make sure the government paid what it owed on the highway contracts. The catch was that Davis would need to pay a $100,000 advance and give Tony a house. Davis paid $50,000 on two separate occasions. In one meeting with Juan Avila and an attorney named Oscar Ramirez, who said was representing Tony, Oscar told him that Tony wanted to speak to him directly about future drug deals and asked him to bring copies of the Inrimar contracts so he could work on getting them paid out. The recordings also showed the men, including Tony, speaking about how to move forward with the Inrimar contracts given the U.S. sanctions. Since Inrimar was now under investigation, they talked about transferring the contracts to a different front company to avoid the sanctions. Tony asked for the original contracts and said he'd speak with other officials to help make it happen. Back in 2015, law enforcement intercepted multiple phone calls between the MS-13 leader in Honduras, Yulan Arcaga Carrillas, better known as Porky, and one of his partners, David Campbell. In a June 2015 wiretapped phone call, Porky told David that President Juan Orlando had sent an elite police team to kill a trafficker named Byron Ruiz. Byron had worked closely with Tony Hernandez, and according to Porky, the president was afraid Byron might start talking if he ended up extradited to the U.S. In a separate intercepted call from September 2015, Porky said that the president had gifted a drug route to Los Cachiros. They also discussed how Juan Orlando was receiving millions of dollars in bribes from Los Valles and Fernandez Rosa, another major Honduran trafficker who would later be sentenced to life in prison. Porky even mentioned that the Americans already know that Juan Orlando's campaign was financed by drug traffickers, and that's why he's not giving them much help. In one of the calls, Porky even questioned how long Juan Orlando would last in office, saying, "I doubt he'll last from now until June," because they picked up a call from Tigre Bonilla. Historically, Honduras had banned presidential re-election. The country's constitution explicitly limited presidents to a single term of 4 years. But in 2015, the Supreme Court, packed with judges loyal to Juan Orlando, issued a ruling that declared these constitutional prohibitions on re-election inapplicable to presidential elections. The court decision basically removed presidential term limits. It was a controversial decision, and it set the stage for Juan Orlando's 2017 re-election campaign. By 2016, Tony Hernandez's name had started popping up more frequently in the Honduran press, and the stories were linking him more directly to drug trafficking. It was getting harder to keep things under wraps. With another presidential election coming up in 2017, Juan Orlando began taking steps to protect himself. He started to distance himself from his brother, and at the same time he started meeting and contacting U.S. officials more, trying to show them that he was serious about tackling drug trafficking. By mid-2017, Hugo and Amílcar gave Tony and Juan Orlando $500,000 for the re-election campaign, and to ensure that they were protected from arrest and extradition. By the time of the November 2017 election rolled around, Juan Orlando and the National Party controlled all aspects of the Honduran government, including the DLCN, which is the Honduran agency tasked with fighting drug trafficking, and is equivalent to the DEA. Juan Orlando and his allies used all the government organizations to tilt the election results in their favor and shut down anyone who questioned the results. As in previous elections, his campaign relied heavily on millions in drug money. That money was also used to bribe election officials and manipulate the vote count. At one point, they even shut down the computer system of the agency responsible for counting votes. The election was held on November 26, 2017, and the initial results showed opposition candidate Salvador Nasrallah with a clear lead after more than half the votes had been counted. But then the updates suddenly stopped. The next morning, a TSE official confirmed that Salvador still had the lead, around 57% of the vote. But shortly after, the TSE stopped reporting any results. For a day and a half, there were no updates, until the head of the TSE announced that about 1 million votes from rural polling centers were being manually counted at their headquarters. Then, on November 29th, the TSE's data center shut down. They told the public that the shutdown was due to technical issues, but according to Hugo, an engineer had intentionally made the computer system fail to help Juan Orlando. When the system came back online, Juan Orlando was declared the winner, by just over 1 percentage point. The aftermath was explosive. The streets of Honduras erupted in protest, and by December 1st, tens of thousands of people were in the streets, furious over what they saw as a stolen election. But instead of addressing the unrest, Juan Orlando had a National Party official pay gang members to intentionally incite violence during the protests. The idea was to create enough chaos that the authorities could justify cracking down on the protests, including imposing curfews and using force against the protesters. As a result, many people ended up dead, most of them protesters. International human rights groups quickly condemned the violence and flagged serious concerns over the legitimacy of the election. On June 6, 2018, during Juan Orlando's second term, trafficker Neri Lopez Sanabria was a passenger in a vehicle that was stopped by the military police in Honduras. Authorities had already received a tip earlier that day linking him to a drug lab in Santa Barbara. During a search of the vehicle, they uncovered a hidden compartment which had firearms, 2 grenades, nearly $200,000 in cash, and 11 drug ledgers. The ledgers, which belonged to Neri, documented how much cocaine was moved, who had it cut, how payments were structured, and who was getting paid off for protection. The ledgers contained handwritten references to JOH, Juan Orlando Hernández, and TH, Tony Hernandez, linking both of them to large-scale cocaine transactions. One entry dated February 27, 2018, was labeled hard work and described a 650-kilogram cocaine shipment. According to the ledger, Tony Hernandez was behind the shipment and had sent it via a Navajo aircraft. Of the 650 kilograms on board, 490 were his. He charged $9,300 per kilogram and had received $1 million payment up front and owed a total of $4.9 million. The ledger also shows that Neri made a payment for information about law enforcement radar used to track airplanes used to traffic drugs. After this evidence came to light, Tony Hernandez was arrested in the United States on November 23, 2018. He was about to board a flight from Miami back to Honduras after having flown into Houston earlier that same week. The arrest was based on criminal charges filed in the Southern District of New York in relation to narcotics and weapons offenses. And with that, rumors started spreading that some of Juan Orlando's trafficking partners were thinking about turning themselves in. According to witnesses, Juan Orlando grew increasingly paranoid and started working to make sure that nobody close to him flipped. He sent out a clear message that if his name got dragged into anything, people would be in danger. Those same ledgers ended up being used as key evidence during Tony's trial a year later in October 2019. During this time, Neri was in prison in Honduras with charges pending in the U.S. His lawyers later told the media that members of the Hernandez family, including one of Juan Orlando's brothers, and an investigator named Chase Lalani, had visited Neri in prison before the trial. They wanted to know if he was cooperating with the DEA, and Neri refused to answer them. According to his attorneys, he fully intended to cooperate against both Tony and Juan Orlando. In October 2019, Tony Hernandez was found guilty of conspiring to import cocaine into the United States, using and carrying machine guns during and possessing machine guns in furtherance of the cocaine importation conspiracy, conspiring to use and carry machine guns during and to possess machine guns in furtherance of the cocaine importation conspiracy, and making false statements to federal agents. Just days later, Neri Lopez Sanabria was murdered inside a maximum security prison in Santa Barbara. A leaked security video shows what happened just before the murder. Neri is seen talking with the prison warden, Pedro Ildefonso Armas, when a masked man walks past and unlocks a nearby door. Moments later, several men stormed in and brutally murdered him, shooting and stabbing him right there in the prison. Not long after, Neri's widow, Erica Bandy, spoke from prison in an interview with a local media outlet. She said her husband had warned her that the president of this country was going to kill him because of what he knew about him and his brother. She also claimed they had proof. Within weeks of that interview, both the prison warden who was speaking with Neri and Jose Luis Pinto, Erica and Neri's attorney, were killed. Jose also represented members of the Los Valles cartel. Years later, in June 2023, after she was released from prison, Erica herself was murdered, gunned down in Honduras by men wearing bulletproof police vests. While the U.S. was still prosecuting Tony Hernandez in 2019, Fuentes went to the Honduran presidential palace to drop off more drug money in exchange for continued protection. Data recovered from Fuentes' cell phone showed he visited Casa Presidencial on 2 separate occasions, and both visits took place on days tied directly to the U.S. investigation into Tony Hernandez. The first visit was on May 29th, just one day after Tony Hernandez was publicly named as a co-conspirator in court filings. The second was on June 12th, the day Tony filed a reply brief. That year, the two also met in Graneros, where Fuentes gave Juan Orlando a bribe of about 450,000 lempiras. The payments were made to keep Fuentes protected, ensuring he wouldn't be arrested inside Honduras. On November 28, 2021, Honduras held its presidential election. The winner was Libre Party member Xiomara Castro, the country's first female president, and wife of former president Jose Manuel Zelaya. She officially took office on January 27, 2022. One of the key promises of her campaign was a tough stance against drug trafficking, and her administration supported extraditing Honduran nationals to the United States to face justice. Once Xiomara Castro won the presidency, Juan Orlando knew the pressure was only going to increase. He was no longer untouchable. The same day Xiomara Castro took office, Juan Orlando was indicted in the U.S., and a warrant was issued for his arrest. Count 1 of the indictment charged him with conspiracy to import cocaine into the United States. Count 2 charged him with possession of machine guns and destructive devices. And Count 3 charged him with conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices. Just a few weeks later, on February 15th, Honduran authorities took him into custody at the request of the United States. The extradition process moved fast. The U.S. submitted its formal request, and a Honduran magistrate judge approved it. Juan Orlando fought back, appealing all the way to the Supreme Court of Honduras, but the court denied his appeal on March 28th. By April 13th, the Honduran government certified the extradition proceedings, resulting in Juan Orlando's surrender to the United States on April 21st. Many traffickers who were facing charges ended up cooperating with the feds and testifying. These people include Victor Hugo Diaz Morales, Amílcar Alexander Ardón Soriano, Fernando Chang Monroy, Dalvis Leonel Rivera Maradiaga, Miguel and Luis Valle, Mario Guillermo Vargas, and Fabio Lobo. Juan Orlando took the stand in his own defense. Over 2 days of testimony, he denied any involvement with drug traffickers and swore under oath that he never accepted a single bribe from anyone connected to the drug trade. He claimed he had never even met Geovanny Fuentes Ramirez and tried to distance himself from well-known traffickers. When shown a photo taken during the 2010 World Cup where he's clearly pictured with Miguel Arnulfo Valle, He claimed the photo was fake. He told the court he had never met him. But the jury didn't buy it. On March 8, 2024, a jury convicted Juan Orlando Hernández of conspiring to import over 400 tons of cocaine into the United States and using and conspiring to use machine guns in furtherance of that conspiracy. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. Tony Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison in March 2021. Thank you for watching.